Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 333. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I got a lot to talk about on today's show. The war in Ukraine is set up right now to have a series of significant escalations in the coming days and weeks ahead. So I want to break all of that down. What's happening in Ukraine, Moscow, and Kiev that's making this all happen. Also, want to tell people that right now at antiwar.com, we are holding our fall fundraiser. So if you would like to help support a lot of really good independent journalism that critically covers the military industrial complex in Washington, then please head on over to antiwar.com and make a donation. The show is, as always, hosted through the Libertarian Institute. You can find the show on YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee if you want the video version. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. And another great way to support the show and to support yourself is to do your CBD shopping with Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. The promo code is PEACE. And when you use that promo code, you're going to save 20% and the show is going to get a kickback. So I know, there's a lot of people in my audience who are libertarians or, just people who don't follow the establishment and are very familiar with why CBD and cannabinoids in general are very helpful. And so you're already using those products. Well, Paloma Verde has a wide variety and a great selection, whatever you want: gummies, tinctures, soft gels, even products for your dog. They got it at Paloma Verde. When you use that promo code PEACE, you're going to get that CBD at a good price and you're going to help your favorite show. So great way to help yourself, great way to help the show. And now let's get into the articles I have today. First up, article from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. We now have a new funding bill for the war in Ukraine. All right, the title of today's article is Senate approves up to $16 billion in Ukraine aid as part of funding bill Biden signs late Friday. So the Senate on Thursday approved, then Biden signed on Friday, a stopgap funding bill needed to avoid a government shutdown that includes up to $16 billion in new aid for Ukraine. The legislation passed the Senate with a vote of 72 to 25 and is expected to be passed quickly by the House so it can reach the president's steps by Friday night, which obviously is what happened. One provision in the bill is for a $12.3 billion aid package for Ukraine. It includes $4.5 billion in direct budgetary aid for the Ukrainian government, $2.8 billion for the Pentagon to pay for troop deployments to Eastern Europe, $1.5 billion to replenish U.S. stockpiles sent to Ukraine, and $3 billion for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative. The USI allows the U.S. government to purchase weapons for Ukraine. The stopgap funding bill includes a separate authorization for $3.7 billion in the Presidential Drawdown Authority, which allows Biden to ship Ukraine weapons directly from U.S. military stockpiles. So far, the U.S. has given Kiev $12 billion in arms using this executive authority since Russia invaded in February. And so this is, something I've talked about a lot on the show, how essentially this PDA, is the acronym for this account, is working as a presidential slush fund, and the president can now send weapons wherever the president wants, with almost no congressional oversight other than the fact that the Congress has to, at least to some degree, fund this account. But who knows? The president can always move money around and things like that if it ever really got contentious. The stopgap funding bill includes a separate authorization for $3.7 billion. Defense News report that Republicans were pressing Biden to use $2.1 billion from the presidential drawdown that was left over from the $40 billion Ukraine bill that was signed into law in May. That aid expires on September 30th, and the Republican leadership in Congress is not happy that Biden didn't use that $2.1 billion. But the Biden administration said that the $2.1 billion was factored into its request for $3.7 billion in the PDA coming up here. Meanwhile, the White House asked for 1.6 billion in new presidential drawdown authority. And so they just want to roll over that 2.1 billion. The Republicans just said, you should spend it faster, and probably offered to give more. Now, one of the ways the arms will be making it much quicker, I think, to Ukraine is because the Pentagon set up a new command for arming Ukraine. This is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. The U.S. is planning to establish a new command base in Germany that will focus entirely on supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia. The New York Times reported on Thursday. Establishing the command would be a part of the Western effort to support Ukraine in the long term, as there's no signs the war is ending anytime soon. The command would oversee arming and training of Ukrainian forces. And so, not only I think is this significant in two ways. It's a pretty major escalation when it comes to how much the U.S. is planning to be involved in this war. If they set up this command, I think it probably means more involvement. And of course, how these things tend to work. If this command gets set up, well, it's not going to get disbanded. It's just going to have to find something else to do. Also, I think this means that they are really looking at years for this war to drag on for. And as we'll get into later with the territory disputes now, that's very well possible. U.S. officials told the Time that General Christopher G. Cavoli, the top U.S. military officer in Europe, recently submitted a proposal to Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin on establishing the command. Austin is reviewing the plans and expected to make a decision in the coming weeks, and the idea is said to be favored by the White House and the Pentagon. The command would be led by a high-ranking U.S. general that would carry out decisions made by the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, a coalition of about 40 countries that was established after the Russian invasion. Austin has led meetings of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group at the Ramstein Air Base in Germany, where he's secured more support for Ukraine. The command would be established in Germany, which is where most of the U.S. training of Ukrainian troops has taken place. The command would also oversee other assistance to Ukraine that has been shipped elsewhere in Europe, including to a mission in Poland where the U.S. troops help maintain Ukraine's weapons remotely. Now, this article I wrote for antiwar.com on Friday, September 30th, and it's titled, Ukraine Vows to Liberate Territory Annexed by Moscow. A high-ranking Ukrainian official vowed his country would retake the regions annexed by Russia. The Kremlin has pledged to defend the territories it acquired on Friday with Moscow's full arsenal of weapons. In an interview with Politico, an advisor to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said, "For our plans, Russia's annexation doesn't matter. We will protect our land using our forces. The nation should liberate all its territories," he said. From September 23rd to 27th, Russia organized a vote in 4 regions of Ukraine under Moscow's control after announcing referendums in the Donbass republics and the 2 southern regions of Ukraine. Top Russian officials said the newly annexed territory would be treated as the rest of the homeland. Russian President Vladimir Putin recently suggested he could deploy nuclear weapons to defend his country. So I've broken down like my feelings on the referendums. I really don't think you could hold accurate referendums in this situation during wartime like this. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of problems here. I'm sure there's a lot of people who, if Russia just assumes control of this territory, who have left this area. And when I say a lot, I don't mean a majority. I mean, like tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 people or so. But, multiple families here that were just absolutely, ruined by this, and whose, house is in this region and it's now under the control of Russia. Well, they can't go back because they sided with Kiev. And so, that they probably just had to abandon their property, and that's it for, them owning that particular property. It could be, absolutely huge. And I see a lot of really serious issues for a lot of people here. But Anyways, getting back to this, it does seem that there's a lot of people, and when I do say a lot here, I probably mean a majority, certainly in the Donbass republics, but likely in these southern regions too, of the people that live there that do want to be ruled by Moscow over Kiev, and so who did vote to join Russia. And so now Russia is saying that, hey, we're going to protect this territory, and Ukraine is saying that no, we're going to retake it. It appears likely Kiev and its Western allies will attempt to conquer the regions that are now claimed by Moscow. The White House has already greenlit Ukrainian attacks on the Crimean Peninsula, a region of Ukraine that was annexed by Russia in 2014. And as I've talked about, that annexation is, as far as state actions go, is a fairly legitimate one. There's referendums that show that's what the people wanted. It was brought on by actions by the government in Kiev and the U.S. coup in Ukraine and all of this. So, the fact that the U.S. has greenlit attacks on Crimea, which is an area of Russia that is somewhat fairly claimed by Russia, means there's no chance the White House is going to try to restrict Ukraine, I think, on carrying out attacks on the Donbass or the southern oblast. Some Western observers believe Putin is bluffing, and this is from Politico. Ukrainian attacks on Crimea and even strikes into Russian proper over the course of the 7-month war have not led to such retaliation. The Ukrainian advisor to Zelensky additionally called for more weapons and suggested Russian soldiers would be easy to kill, while commenting on Putin's decision to call up 300,000 additional troops. He said, "This army is being replaced by absolutely untrained people, a living resource that has been thrown into the front lines and will simply be exterminated." And one thing I want to mention here that I think is important is just the contrast in coverage between when Ukraine ordered like a full mobilization of its male population versus when Russia, ordered up 3,000 or 300,000, or I think I've read some people are saying that it's actually 1.2 million, which, if there's Russia's a fairly large country, so if you're only calling up 300,000 and you have that many young men fleeing the country, I'm not sure that would make sense. But if they are calling up 1.2 million, 4 times as many, then maybe that really increases people's odds and start to make people really nervous about staying in Russia. So that number could be a little bit higher. But anyways, when Ukraine did this, and nobody has a problem with the government in Kiev. Nobody is saying, "Oh, you're sending untrained troops to slaughter," or anything like that. Yet when Russia does it, you get that kind of narrative coming out from the West and from the mainstream media. So I think the most important thing I have to talk about on the show today is this article that myself and Connor Freeman wrote for the Libertarian Institute Monday, October 3rd. Kiev offers White House targeting control seats longer range weapons. The Ukraine government is prepared to give the Biden administration virtual control over a selection of Russian targets. Kiev made the proposal in a bid to receive longer range weapons from the White House, according to multiple sources speaking with CNN. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky will provide a full list of possible targets while allowing the White House to veto any potential sites. Kiev is hoping the increased transparency and control will pave the way for the Biden administration to authorizing more weapons transfers. Zelensky made the offer to Washington to alleviate concerns in the Biden administration that the weapons will be used to target Russian territory. However, this is really interesting because there's pretty overt mentions now, especially in the Times of London. We just, that in Politico, the writer there just mentions it. I just read in the other article that there have been cross-border attacks into Russia itself. And so is it really the concern of the White House? And I guess maybe it is. I would assume that the White House is probably telling Ukraine, like, hey, we're nervous about doing it for this reason. Or at least Ukraine is able to have contacts with people in the White House who inform them of what the issues are. And if they're making this proposal to try to alleviate those concerns, they must be very convinced that is the holdup to them getting more weapons. And so Not sure, why this is, the White House is concerned about that when it already seems to be going on. But this would essentially allow the White House to pit targets, right? If they're scratching all targets off the list, maybe Ukraine and Kiev, they get to prioritize it. But I'm guessing that the White House, says, oh, that's your list of targets. Well, we'll send you 100 missiles if you hit, targets 1 through 50. Well, that means that the U.S. really is running this war. And when we have in the past on the show given analysis to the war in Yemen, and if American officials could be, not in the moral sense, because obviously in the moral sense Washington is already driving this war in Kiev, but when we look at like international law and what actually makes like another country potentially liable for committing war crimes, if the U.S. is picking targets, that is something that makes you more open to that kind of prosecution and things like that. There were Obama administration officials who were concerned about their involvement in helping Saudi Arabia pit targets in Yemen, really opened them up to war crime prosecution. Now, this is going back to our article. However, Kiev, Washington, Moscow currently have different views on what is Russian versus Ukrainian territory. After a 2014 coup in Ukraine that saw U.S.-backed elements throw a democratically elected government, Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula. Last week, Moscow claimed 4 additional regions of Ukraine as its own. Russian President Vladimir Putin vowed to defend all his country's territory with the full arsenal at his disposal. The Kremlin stated that it considers its newly added regions as it would the rest of Russia. On Sunday, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin acknowledged the possibility that Putin could order a nuclear strike in Ukraine, defending these regions. The Pentagon chief vowed that Washington would support Kiev's effort for as long as it takes to take back the territories within sovereign borders. Concurrently, Moscow claims there has been an increase in Ukrainian attacks within Russian proper, encouraged by NATO. During a recent press conference, Putin publicly noted for the first time attempted Ukrainian attacks on Russian nuclear power plants. And look, has Putin provided sufficient evidence that those attacks are occurring? But if the Kremlin actually believes those attacks are occurring, that's really what matters here. The U.S. has provided Ukraine with 16 high-mobility artillery rocket systems, HIMARS, and authorized sending over a dozen more to Kiev in an arms package last week. So far, the White House has only sent Ukraine munitions for HIMARS that include that can travel 50 miles. Kiev is seeking Army Tactical Missile Systems, ATACMS, surface-to-surface missiles that could fly around 200 missiles fired by the HIMARS. When the Biden administration began providing HIMARS to Ukraine, it insisted that Kiev had provided assurances that these weapons would not be used to target Russian territory. In June, antiwar.com contacted the State Department to ask if this condition applied to the Crimean Peninsula. A department spokesperson replied, "Crimea is Ukraine," suggesting obviously that, yeah, they could use HIMARS and those rockets to target Crimea. The White House has made clear that they will not recognize the newly Russian annexed territories as belonging to Moscow, and NATO said they will escalate their support for the proxy war, meaning they will give more weapons to Kiev. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has previously said that if the West provides Kiev with longer-range weapons, then the Kremlin would expand its war goals in Ukraine. In July, Lavrov wrote an article claiming NATO was already on the battlefield coordinating attacks on Russian targets using the rocket systems. NATO instructors and multiple launch rocket system aimers are apparently already directing the actions of the Ukrainian armed forces and nationalist battalions on the ground. Lavrov said this has also been fairly well reported in the Western press, as we mentioned in this next paragraph. In addition to the CIA presence on the ground in Ukraine, NATO commanders from Lithuania, Canada, Britain, and France are also present. Notably, there are several Donald Trump-aligned Republicans in the legislature, including Rep. Mike Waltz, eager to go for the kill and overtly deploy American advisors to Ukraine. Former special operators are already on the ground near the contact line, training Kiev's forces and developing battle plans. Henry Kazians wrote in Responsible Statecraft that in multiple war game situations, Washington sending advanced weapons led to nuclear war. I have fought more than 30 combat situations in war games under my own direction for a private defense contract, and every single scenario I tested, the Biden administration slowly gives more weapons to Ukraine, ever more advanced weapons like the ATACMS, F-16s, and other platforms that Russia has consistently warned pose a direct threat. And in fact, in 28 of those 30 scenarios I have run since the war began, some sort of nuclear exchange occurs. Kazians does report that some of the war games end diplomatically rather than the escalation prevailed, and nuclear conflict was averted. The good news is that there are some ways out of this crisis, however imperfect it may be. In the two scenarios where nuclear war was averted, direct negotiations led to a ceasefire. The Biden administration and its NATO allies should be testing Putin's recent comments about a ceasefire to see his seriousness. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, American top diplomat, has declared Washington's goal in Russia is to see Russia suffer a strategic defeat in Ukraine. During the war, he has spoken to Lavrov once for 25 minutes. They merely discussed a potential bilateral prisoner exchange. Likewise, UK Prime Minister ruled out diplomacy with Moscow and said Russia must be defeated. So, you know, a lot of bad news in this article, and again, a little bit more that I want to expand on here. One, you know, the Biden administration is driving down the path to nuclear war at this point. The only exit path is diplomacy with Moscow. Now, I do want to mention that, you know, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think a lot of the negotiations and talks between Kennedy and Khrushchev were kept essentially secret. Now, I don't think that would happen now. I think sources within the White House would start to leak this, and we hear from the New York Times and Washington Post that Biden spoke with Putin after it happened, at least, but probably, you know, leading up to it, we would hear about it before. But nonetheless, you know, it's very important to look back, and I think it's been 60 years now since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and realize that the only way that these, you know, kind of very heightened tensions that we are currently now facing over Ukraine are going to be in any way de-escalated is by direct talks between the Biden administration and Vladimir Putin. And I think at least enough mutual respect from the two leaders to stop calling for the other's removal from power, which, you know, is mainly happening from the American side. The next article that myself and Connor Freeman had from yesterday: Lithuania calls for NATO to begin talks on admitting Ukraine. Lithuania is urging the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to begin negotiations regarding Ukraine's prospective membership. Though Lithuania acknowledged Kiev is unlikely to be admitted for some time, last week Ukrainian President Zelensky called for Brussels to accelerate Kiev's NATO membership. Lithuanian Defense Minister said the key thing is not simplify NATO admission procedures applied in Sweden and Finland's case, but the consensus of 30 countries that Ukraine can be admitted to NATO, and that process itself must start despite the war. And so I think what Lithuania is looking to do here isn't necessarily to have Ukraine admitted even within the next year, but they know that once the snowball gets rolling, it's going to be hard to slow down. So they want to like give that, you know, first like ball of snow at the top of the hill a real kick here, and to get the talks going. Stockholm and Helsinki, who the defense minister, you know, compared and contrasted NATO's membership to, applied for NATO membership in June, and recently, a White House official said they expect Sweden and Finland to be formally admitted by Christmas. However, Turkey reissued threats this week to veto membership for the two Nordic states if they fail to implement their trilateral agreement with Ankara. NATO membership requires the support of all other members, and so I think by the time that Ukraine is looking to join NATO, they're going to be 32 states, Finland and Sweden added, and they would then need support of all 32 states because, it's signing a defense pact with all these countries. According to the Lithuanian defense minister, Ukraine has Lithuania's unconditional support, though he admits it seems to be an unattainable goal. In June, the New York Times reported, citing U.S. officials, that Lithuania is one of 4 NATO states which has forces deployed to the Ukrainian battlefield. Lithuanian commandos are training and advising Ukrainian troops and providing an on-the-ground conduit for weapons and other aid. If Ukraine were admitted into NATO, it would put the alliance directly at war with Moscow, in a more significant way than it already is. Russia currently controls 5 areas of Ukraine claimed by Kiev after the Kremlin announced it annexed Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia last week. Zelensky vowed Ukraine would retake all its territory. At the same time, he renewed his push to have Kiev admitted into the Brussels-based alliance in an accelerated membership process. Zelensky went on to claim that Kiev is already a de facto NATO member. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and Biden's National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan dismissed the Ukrainian leader's request. Washington and Brussels pledged to provide more military assistance to Ukraine, though. And so this kind of goes along with what we've been talking about on the show. They're really only interested in fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian and not fighting Russia with any Americans or really any other European people. It's just, we're going to give Ukraine money to weaken Russia as much as possible. As many Ukrainians as have to die, and, they're happy about the Russians that die in this, but, as many Ukrainians have, that's unfortunate for them, but that's, to the extent that they're willing to fight Russia. Next article here, this is from antiwar.com, Friday, September 30th. Zelensky says Ukraine already a de facto NATO member. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky vowed his country would be submitting an accelerated bid to join NATO on Friday. He made the announcement shortly after Russian President Putin signed documents to formally annex 4 regions of Ukraine. Zelensky said the alliance should welcome Kiev as it's already a de facto NATO member. I already talked about this a little bit, but I did want to break it down just a little bit more because this is such an important statement from Zelensky that carries so much truth, but it does come up a little bit short. There are reasons that Ukraine is not going to be admitted into NATO. And one, there are now 5 regions of Ukraine that Russia controls and Russia claims as its own. Now, Russia doesn't control all the Donetsk province, and certainly not all of Zaporizhia or Kherson either, but the fact that these areas are mostly under Russian control and also claimed by Kiev means that if NATO enters officially with Ukraine, then it's going to put them directly involved in Russia. Also, there's a lot of internal corruption in Kiev, and I know that it's a very unpopular thing to talk about this time. And in the midst of a war, and if this was really a core national interest of the United States, it may be debatable how much of an issue the corruption within Kiev is for the United States, but this isn't a core U.S. issue. And if any of the money that we're dumping in Ukraine is being used for corrupt causes, then it'd probably be wise to just move on from the situation. But that's obviously not what NATO is looking to do here. So I'm sure this is going to be seen as very inflammatory by Moscow as well. But in some ways, maybe Moscow will be happy that at least someone, even if it is Zelensky, is saying the quiet part out loud. Now, there have been gains by Ukrainian forces in the southern Kherson region, and so Putin has pledged that he's going to defend this territory like it's Russian. What that means is yet to be seen. I don't think we're at the point where Russia is going to use a tactical battlefield nuke or actually nuke a Ukrainian city. I think Russia has a lot more military capabilities that they haven't rolled out yet. However, if Ukraine continues to make gains, it's going to surprise me if Russia doesn't make some major escalation in this war. This is an interesting article that Dave DeCamp wrote for antiwar.com yesterday. Ukraine tells EU delays in delivering billions in aid not acceptable. And this is one of those, great just examples of who is, the superpower here, who is receiving the donations and who is the donor. They may be able to say like, hey, you're not helping us out as much as that you said you were going to. But the way that this is phrased by the Ukrainians is quite bold. Now, I want to talk about two more articles here before I wrap up the show. The first one is just so telling. It's so telling about, what the mainstream media actually believes. This from Dave DeCamp. Ukrainian diplomat tells Elon Musk to F off for floating idea for peace plan. Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla and SpaceX, not Twitter, or at least not yet, angered Ukrainian officials on Monday when he tweeted a potential idea for peace deal in Ukraine along with a poll to gain public support. Musk wrote on Twitter that the peace plan should consist of 3 planks: redo elections in annexed regions under UN supervision, Russia leaves if it's the will of the people, Crimea is formally a part of Russia, and he actually says in here, as it has been since 1783 until Khrushchev's mistake. And so, credit to Elon for having more than just like an American understanding of this. Now, he is South African, so maybe he just naturally gets a little bit more worldly sources of news and is aware that the Crimean Peninsula hasn't always been a part of Ukraine or something like that. But, very interesting. He throws that into this tweet, and I'm sure that's a part of why he got such a harsh reaction from some Ukrainian officials. He says water supply to Crimea must be assured and Ukraine remains neutral. And so I think in a subsequent tweet, Musk says something along the lines of, well, he believes it's highly likely that the above proposal will eventually happen. It's just a question of how many people have to die. He also noted that a possible outcome of the conflict is nuclear war. And then everybody got very upset with him, the Ukrainian ambassador, and just a host of other mainstream people. It becomes very obvious that just some guy, right, tweeting out like, hey, maybe we should do this to try to have a peaceful resolution here, it is so telling about what those people actually want. Now, the last article I wrote yesterday is titled "North Korea Fires Missile Over Japan." For the first time since 2017, North Korea has fired a missile that is believed, and I think it's pretty confirmed now, to have gone over northern Japanese territory. Habitable people live there. They had to warn some people to take shelter. Now, I don't think anybody was really concerned that the missile was going to strike, but of course, missiles, especially missiles in test flights, can fall out of have malfunctions and things like that. And so, this is a pretty serious escalation, and it's just another step, right? So we've seen North Korea walk away from its hiatus on missile tests because the Biden administration completely walked away from diplomacy with Pyongyang. And so that led to more North Korean missile tests, which led to the U.S. and South Korea engaging in more war games, signing trilateral pacts with Japan, and which for both North and South Korea has not that long ago in history pretty serious implications with, the slavery and how terrible Japanese colonialism was for the entire Korean peninsula. And so My guess is that's seen as particularly provocative by Pyongyang. The U.S. is sending the Ronald Reagan, the aircraft carrier, to South Korea, and then of course Kamala Harris going to South Korea, traveling to the DMZ, just slamming the North Korean government, just saying a whole bunch of provocative things about the North Korean government, and then demanding the North Korean government denuclearize, and at the same time asserting that in South Korea they are under the protection of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. So it's just such a joke and such a provocation that it's just going to lead to more problems and more escalation. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show today. Just gonna round out here with I'm at Kyle Anzalone _ on Twitter, and support the antiwar.com fund drive. Thanks, everyone.